America has a rich history full of heroes of all types, but the ones we hear the least about are African-American heroes. African-American heroes have been part of American history from the very beginning. Our tendency in textbooks today is when we tell about black history, we start in the 1960s and move forward.
Right.
And that's an important era of history. Dr. Martin Luther King and all the things that went with that, the March through Selma, the March on D.C., it's all important. But that's not where black history starts.
Right.
We have some real heroes of black history that we can take way back to the beginning. Great example is Richard Allen. Richard Allen is an African-American who became the founder of the first black denomination in America. His is a great story. He was raised as a slave in Delaware, living as a slave on a plantation in Delaware. And a Methodist evangelist came riding across that plantation preaching the gospel. Richard Allen hears the gospel, he gives his life to Christ, becomes not only a Christian, he becomes a zealous Christian. Richard Allen started sharing Christ with everything that moved on that plantation. And shortly the slave master became a Christian. The slave master says, "What am I doing owning slaves?" So Richard gets his freedom. Well, Richard wants to keep preaching the gospel. So he walks out of that plantation, walks out of Delaware, going north. He ends up in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia at that time was the nation's third largest city. There were 40,000 people in Philadelphia. You can imagine that being the nation's third largest city. Richard ends up preaching in a church in Philadelphia where he's preaching to 2,000 people a week. Now, that's a mega church today, but that's really a mega church. But, oh, and by the way, it was a white church that he was pastoring back then.
Wow.
No, wait a minute, they didn't do that back then? Oh, yeah. There are so many examples of black and white together in early American history. There's definitely racial conflict as you go through parts of history, but there was so much cooperation that we never hear about. And so Richard Allen, great patriot that he is, actually becomes one of the soldiers in the American Revolution. So here's a pastor. He's a soldier in the American Revolution. He gets hooked up with signer of the Declaration, Dr. Benjamin Rush. So here's an Anglo. Here's an African-American. They're working together. It's those two guys that formed the first black denomination in America. The AME denomination was founded by a black and a white working together. Then if you take that relationship, move forward a little bit, what you find is the period of what's called the yellow fever epidemic. The yellow fever epidemic of Philadelphia was 1793. It was terrible. No one knew what caused yellow fever back then. And so it terrorized everyone because they were losing about 120 people a day in the city to yellow fever. They were just dying off. 1/10 of the city died in that period of time. There were about 70 doctors in the city. They all left the city because they're scared to death. They're going to get yellow fever. They don't know what causes it. Well, Dr. Benjamin Rush was one of the very few who stayed in the city. He's called the father of American medicine. And the two guys that worked with him to treat yellow fever, the three of them that worked together to service that whole city, you had Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration, but you had Richard Allen, and you had another black pastor, Absalom Jones. Absalom Jones is the first black bishop in the Episcopal Church, and those three guys treated so much of Philadelphia. So there you've got this huge crisis going on, and what do you have? You have a white and two blacks working side by side to treat that epidemic. Great story of American history, great story of medicine, but we just don't hear it.